I'm excited to be here and share with you a little bit of an Indigenous perspective with some Indigenous voices. So a few weeks ago, or 5 weeks ago to be exact, I got an invitation from a friend to attend Red River Conference on the launch of the first Manitoba Cannabis 101 course that's offered at Red River College. And so when I got this invitation, I wasn't completely sure if I was interested in going, because I thought, even when I would hear about cannabis becoming legal, well, what does it really have to do with me? I don't really know if I'm interested in doing this. But I had a day available, so I thought I would go to the event. And what I experienced at the conference was something totally unexpected and very pleasant. So one of the things that we learned was it's not about Cheech and Chong, which was one of the quotes that was shared at Red River. And that legalization was really about opportunity, and in this context, opportunity for First Nation communities. There were several Indigenous leaders, chiefs, entrepreneurs, and panelists at this event. And what I was very impressed to learn was that First Nation communities were already blazing trails in this industry. So a couple of things that we've already heard. Peguis First Nation has a Canada-wide partnership with GrowForce and the largest production facility in Manitoba. Opaskwayak Cree Nation is one of the largest investors in national access cannabis and the Meta stores. And what I really learned is that it was about alternatives for treating common medical issues that families and people in our communities are suffering from. And so a lot of it was about wellness, and so I was really much more interested in being part of this conversation. It was also about creating jobs in cultivation, distribution, and retail. And so I want to, first of all, acknowledge the Indigenous leadership that's been involved in supporting all of the work that has created these opportunities for First Nation communities, and also thank the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce for including First Nation dialogue in this event today. So I'm going to invite up my speakers. I don't know where they went. Okay, maybe as I announce their name, they'll come out. So I'd like to invite Dr. Shelley Turner. She's from Cross Lake First Nation. And Shelley works in the area of addiction medicine. Her work in healthcare with vulnerable populations has shaped the direction of her current clinical and research practice in cannabinoid therapy. Her clinic, First Pharmacy Medical, is focused on harm and pharma reduction strategies. Dr. Shelley Turner will be leading the new Cannabis 101 course at Red River College that explores business behind cannabis. Welcome, Dr. Turner. I'd also like to invite Rebecca Chartrand, who's a proud member of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Métis Nation. Currently, she's the Executive Director of Indigenous Strategy at Red River College. In addition to supporting initiatives college-wide, she oversees the School of Indigenous Education, and she's worked in education for the past 25 years. So welcome, Rebecca. There she is. And I'd like to invite Councillor Stephen Prince, who oversees economic and business development for Long Plain First Nation, alongside Chief Dennis Meaches. His portfolio includes the opening of Meta Cannabis Supply, working directly with National Access Cannabis Corp. And he's also an experienced athlete and coach for Team Canada, and was inducted into the World Sikaran Hall of Fame. Thank you very much for joining me, each of you. Okay, well, thank you for being here. So we'll just get right into it. So I told you a little bit about my introduction into my interest in this industry suddenly. And so I'd like to hear, what was the drive to get you started in this industry?
I guess I'll have to start. When I was a youth, I was diagnosed with glaucoma, and of course I started researching. Of course, the internet just came out, and I found a site that said medical marijuana can help either stop the process of glaucoma or possibly even reverse it. So for me, I went out and, for lack of better words, I believed in the Cheech and Chong philosophy, and I proceeded to smoke and medicate myself. 2 years later, My optometrist was baffled because he couldn't understand how I no longer had glaucoma, and so for me it was a personal insight in that way, and that's how I got involved. I saw the benefits at a very young age, and I always had a plan in the back of my mind that when I started my political life that I was going to pursue legalizing marijuana on First Nations.
Good timing, great.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
So my role at the college is Executive Director of Indigenous Strategy, and from that perspective I'm always looking at what can we be doing to grow into various industries. So this really was a call to action for me. We had Chief Christian Sinclair, who's from OCN First Nations, approach us back in February asking what are we doing to help grow into this industry. So from a workforce perspective, and from my position as a ED of Indigenous Strategy, we want to make sure that we're creating opportunity for Indigenous people to grow into the industry. From an educational perspective, we also have to look at our responsibility to help educate. So the first course that we developed was a Cannabis 101 course, and that course is really focused on understanding the safety and regulations that go along with the legalization of this industry. But for the most part, it's really about looking at those opportunities again for First Nations. So that's personally how I stepped into it. I also want to mention that on a personal level, I did take a crash course in California to learn about cannabis, and it really did help me destigmatize a lot of my understanding about cannabis. And so I think we have a long way to go in just public education around this piece. So, yeah.
Great, and Dr. Turner?
So I kind of had a similar experience to the previous speaker about imagining yourself up on a stage talking about cannabis 10 years into your career and going, yeah, this is what I'm doing. This is how I'm going to make change. Never in a million years. So my background is I'm a family physician with extra training in addiction medicine. And I've been working in the field, working with vulnerable populations for 25, 30 years. I was a former nurse here at the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority 100 years ago. And I worked at 705 Broadway, which was, working on the van and street health. And I had an epiphany. I sadly had a woman come to our van one night who had been beaten by a John. And she had a cut on her forehead. And I had done a lot of work up north. I could suture, I could do all those things that we can do at a certain latitude, but apparently your brains drop out somewhere, south of Barons River, I'm not sure. So I wasn't allowed to suture that person. And I talked to my boss about it, and they said, we're not ready to do that. And so I applied to medical school, and here I am 15 years later. The population, so my practice is in Thunder Bay, but I'm opening a new clinic in Gimli, Manitoba, which is where I grew up. Thunder Bay has a large population of folks that are living with opiate addiction, and I think that translates to all of our big centers and the devastation that creates in the community. So about 5 years ago, my patients, a couple of them, I thought, okay, these guys are pretty good candidates. They're using cannabis. Let's see what happens. Well, so here I am now. I have 4,000 cannabis patients. I have about 12,000 patient interactions. The majority of my patients are looking to get well and to de-prescribe. So what I do is actually look at the litany of medications that these patients are on, from anything from fibromyalgia to chronic non-malignant pain to cancer pain to menopause. And I don't know how many over 50 women are in the room, but sleep is a huge thing. What we discovered was that there's a laundry list of things that we could use this medication for. I think looking forward, gone are going to be the days when we take one pill, which has one molecule, to treat one illness. I have a plant, so whole plant medicine. I've got 500 constituents in that plant that I can throw at somebody. We are primed for cannabis. We have an endocannabinoid system. Does anybody feel high in the room right now? You're making cannabis in your body. How does that help? It helps increase your endocannabinoid tone so that you tolerate things, pain, sleep, and your mood. And for those that are suffering from autoimmune disorders, it boosts that immune system. It helps increase the tone so that you can manage. Does it take away all the medications that we're prescribing? No. We may be able to use less medications with less harmful effects, and that translates into safety in the communities. How many patients have, or how many people here have Tylenol 3, Tylenol 1 in their cupboards at home? Yeah, right. So are they locked up? Are they accessible to people in your house? Like, those are the types of things. So we have to really look at what we keep in our cabinets and make sure that everything's safe. So I'm going to stop talking now because I could go on forever. We have to be really clear about education, and I think that's hugely important.
Great. So a lot about the wellness, that's what I heard at the conference, and that was why I contacted my friends at the Winnipeg Chamber, and I was like, we have to bring this conversation. So in your words, can you please tell us, why should Indigenous people have a significant role in the cannabis industry? Because we're hearing a lot about that. So where does that come from?
Want me to go first? Oh, I guess I'm in the hot seat all the time here. So my belief and the belief my colleagues have is the fact that we are a separate nation within a nation. As Indigenous people, we were never conquered. That's why we treated. So we're trying to have our say in the area where cannabis and the industry can work for us and benefit our communities. There's many things that are the positive, and there is also negative things that come with it. But for us, it's job creation, it's growing our communities. The majority of First Nations in Manitoba, in the southern region, have very good prime farmland. Long Plains in particular, we're getting into not only cannabis but the hemp industry, and obviously hemp is one of the best oxygen producers out there. So we see the benefits of that, and we're just trying to exercise our sovereign rights and get a fair share of the 195 billion that's going to be made in the market in the next 5 to 10 years.
Wow, that's a lot of money. So from an educational perspective, it's really important to contextualize this historically. So the cannabis industry really is the new frontier here in Canada. When we think about Indigenous peoples and the roles that they played or didn't play in the development of our country and its economy, those are important points to remember as we're looking to create space for Indigenous people to grow into this industry. So when we think about First Nations specifically, First Nations have been segregated to reservations throughout this country, were kept out of sight, out of mind while the rest of the country was developing. So when we think about the treaties were promises of mutual obligation and mutual benefit. So when we're thinking about this era that we're in now around truth and reconciliation, it's about reconciling that past. And there's also the element of economic reconciliation. So it's really important to think about things within that context and to recognize that, First Nations should have equal opportunity to grow into this industry. And so that's our role, is trying to create some space to ensure that happens.
I absolutely agree. And one of the other aspects in terms of the economic development, and I think this translates well into all geographic locations in Manitoba, small town communities that are looking to support their community members. And specifically in the age of this opiate crisis and other bad actors that are killing Canadians across Canada, but you see a higher burden of illness within our First Nations communities. And the perspective that I have is in regards to stabilization of those communities using plant-based medicine. You have, when you look at, and I believe it was a 2.3% potential for addiction to cannabis, and I think it's important to clobber us over the head with stats, but I think it's important to really look at a balanced view. So absolutely, are people able to become addicted to cannabis? You bet. But when you look at the numbers, alcohol, tobacco, all very socially acceptable, minus the tobacco, crystal meth, which I know is a huge issue. When I look at research, I look at the big picture. We have the ability to use plant-based medicines to assist our people that are struggling with crystal meth addiction, and this is what I hope to do, is to push that research forward. What is the result of that? It is economic stabilization of your communities. If you don't have a workforce, if your workforce is unwell, how are you going to stabilize them? How will you get that growth in your communities? So you have to look at the big picture. You can talk dollars and all that all you want, but if your community is not well, you don't have a business.
Absolutely, thank you. So at the Red River Conference, I also heard cannabis referred to as a plant of Mother Earth. So what does traditional knowledge have to do with where we are in the cannabis industry?
We'll start with that.
I think it's very exciting, and I think, so I look at my own heritage. My great-grandfather was the chief in Cross Lake, not quite 100 years ago. And going back to the communities, when I worked up in the communities, traditional medicines are sacred and they're secret for some communities, and they're not talked about. And I think this is an opportunity, and I think about this as Anishinaabe people have the teachings, and I think we are coming up to an 8th fire, where this will ignite change in the communities, where we talk about reconciliation. And when you talk about the 8th fire prophecy or teachings, the 8th fire is about settlers and the First Peoples reuniting in harmony, peace, and prosperity. And I think it will be on the back of this cannabis plant, which happens to be female. I think big things are going to happen for First Nations, but in terms of that.
Thank you. I think from a traditional knowledge perspective, when we think about food, food is medicine, or it's not. And so for Indigenous peoples, when you look at historically at our relationship with food was severed. Our access to traditional foods, traditional medicines, those things were actually outlawed, passing on that knowledge as a result of the legislation of the Indian Act. So what you see in our communities now are epidemics of diabetes, obesity, all types of things that have really impacted our health as a result of the food that we're putting into our body. So when we're thinking about traditional foods or traditional medicines, there really is a need to go back and understand, what are the stuff that are going to make us healthy again. And so reconnecting to that, to me, is really about traditional knowledge, traditional food, but combine that with cannabis, and those are discussions that we've been having around research and development, is what can traditional knowledge bring coupled with cannabis to help treat those epidemics in our community. So, we know our knowledge base is growing, people are reconnecting to that, so it's an exciting time. Cannabis is a natural medicine from the earth, so we should continue to explore that to address the issues in our communities and across the country.
I'm not going to follow up at that.
Okay.
They did a wonderful job.
Okay, I have a next question for you. So I know that treaty is still something that's not entirely understood by many Canadians or Winnipeggers. There's, a lot of people still have lots of questions. But if possible, and as quickly as possible, can you share with us some of the association between cannabis opportunities, treaty land entitlement, and urban reserves? What are some benefits there?
Well, some benefits there is the fact that we're going to be able to exercise our jurisdictional rights with our sovereign lands, and it has to be made clear that treaties was a peaceful thing that happened between our peoples. Treaty number 1, for instance, was signed by Henry Prince, who I'm a direct descendant of, and also Chief Peguis with the Selkirk treaties. They created those treaties so that there would be peaceful settlement between the non-Aboriginals and the First Nations. And in doing so, we created a partnership to share the land. However, for lack of better words, I think we got the bad end of the stick. I'm not going to swear here, but we were, for instance, we were segregated to our First Nation lands. It's only been back in the 60s that we have been able to leave the lands. Prior to that, we had to get a pink slip from the Indian agent just to go to town to get some flour or some bread, which, I don't know why that happened, because initially it is our land. We agreed to share it. It's no different than, for instance, the Americans coming here and trying to invoke their laws on Canadian citizens. We are a nation within a nation, and whether the provincial or federal governments want to realize that, we have the right to exercise our own laws, we have the right to exercise our own jurisdiction, and put forth policies and procedures when it comes to cannabis.
Very cool.
So again, I'm going to take this from an educational perspective, being an educator. It's really important to understand what the treaties are. So you might have heard the concept, we are all treaty people. That means I am a treaty person, you are a treaty person, whether you hold a treaty card or not. So I am First Nations, I am treaty. You are treaty because the treaties basically opened up these lands to newcomers to settle into these areas. So without the treaties, you wouldn't have had the opportunities that were afforded to all Canadians. So if you, hands up, do you own private property? Okay, so that opportunity was made possible because of the treaties. So when you look at the Canadian Constitution, Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, it recognizes sovereignty. It recognizes what we just heard, is that First Nations had title to their land. They were sovereign nations. So when Canada formed in 1867, it couldn't come and settle into these territories without signing treaties. And so within this geography, we are settled in Treaty Territory 1. This is where it all began in 1876, just a few years shortly after Confederation. So those treaties opened the floodgates. It allowed people to settle into these territories and to benefit. So to benefit for all Canadians back then and all Canadians today. So from that perspective, it's really important to understand how treaties continue to play out. When we talk about TLE, Treaty Land Entitlement, there were agreements in those treaties to ensure, again, mutual benefit. However, we know today there was many broken promises, which has left First Nations, the poorest of the poor, in our own homeland country. And so when we think about economic reconciliation, again, the idea of urban reserves is giving opportunity for First Nations to come to the center of our mainstream, our economies, and to have equal opportunity.
And so it sounds like with cannabis coming into the whole idea, it's an opportunity to kind of take that step back and say, now we can use this industry as partnerships going forward.
I totally agree with that, and if you look at back, tobacco was introduced a few hundred years from the Indigenous people, and unfortunately, us as Indigenous people, it was our product. We weren't given fair share in the export of that product, and in lack of better words, we were abused, and we weren't allowed to share that tobacco or the revenues from that tobacco. Here with cannabis, we're just trying to exercise our rights so that we get our fair share.
Great. So labor shortages affect almost all areas of our economy. So can you expand on what Red River Indigenous Education is doing and how they're positioning themselves to be prepared for the potential growth in this industry?
Right, so we developed a Cannabis 101 course, and again, it was a call to action from one of our, a couple of our communities, including Long Plains and OCN, and the call to action was, how are we going to support growth into the industry? So as a college, our responsibility is to create the workforce that is needed to support industry or to grow into industry. And so our Cannabis 101 course was developed with subject matter experts like Dr. Shelley Turner, Dr. Faith Dielman, and of course Josh Giesbrecht, who did a lot of work for us on this and bringing subject matter experts to the table. We also had the LGCA there, the Liquor, Gaming and Cannabis Authority. So the whole point of it, again, was education, but to ensure that we were creating opportunity for people to understand, how do you grow into this industry? What kind of jobs can you get? So a key component of the course is safety and regulations, understanding that those pieces, because we know they're changing daily. But also looking at, what can I do? I can maybe work in a retail, I can maybe do transportation, growing. There's all of these different pieces, so we're continuing to have that discussion at the college in terms of what else do we need to do to help people grow into the industry. So the next course that we're developing is something like a bud tenders course or a cannabis customer service rep course that will provide students with enough information to serve clients who come to these retail outlets. So to understand the difference between THC and CBD, the continuum, what might be helpful for maybe some medicinal stuff and some as well as the recreational, because you really want to inform people about what they're getting. You know, what is the difference between 10 milligrams and 100 milligrams, and what is the impact going to be? So those are really important things to teach people who are going to be serving, people in our public. So you have to be safe, you have to be informed, and to have retail experience alone is not enough.
And I think even just from my perspective, so I've been working in this space kind of with my head down, kind of avoiding other colleagues. About 4 years ago, I kept a group, ran a group for problem-based learning with 9 colleagues. And I mentioned that I had been prescribing cannabis to my patients, and two of them at the table looked like they'd smelled something terrible. That has actually, through education, my colleagues are now referring a lot of these patients to me, and some of them even feel confident in their ability to prescribe. So not only within the industry, but within the medical field, there's still cause for concern. We all remember a certain drug that has been the bane of many communities called Percocet, and all the fallout of that. And so a lot of us are kind of sitting here being very cautious. And if anything, I mean, the education piece for colleagues, for nursing practice at Red River College, I think it's hugely important, because we have to destigmatize this. This is another tool in my belt to help my patients. I'm not looking at it like, oh my gosh, their hair's gonna start on fire and they're gonna start singing Bob Marley songs. Like, holy mackerel, it's not gonna happen. My patient range is from 5 to 93. So you have patients that are coming in and they're wanting to be educated. And they go to their physicians, and the doctor's either giving them the bum's rush out the door, or they're saying, you know what, I really don't know, I'll refer you. Or they'll write the prescription themselves. Percentage-wise, probably 90% of the time they're referring, and 5% of the times they're giving the bum's rush out the door. Patients have been called drug addicts from their physicians, from their healthcare providers, because of the lack of knowledge. So supporting programs like Red River College to educate educators, I think, is hugely important.
Yeah, I think that education is probably the biggest, because like I said, if I didn't go to that conference, I probably would still be that person to say, no thanks, I'm not interested in even having that conversation. So with that, with the legalization, the announcement, and the launch of the program, do you have a long waiting list? Like, are there people that are excited to get in, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, so I just want to mention that Dr. Shelley Turner and Dr. Faith Dielman were our instructors for the course. So having them as doctors teach the course brought so much credibility to the work that we're doing at the college. So thank you. So our first course, we didn't have much of a time frame to market or advertise it, but it filled up within a few days. We had to double the intake. So our class size is usually around 24. We doubled that to 45 when we opened that up, and then the final number that we had was 59. So that was with very limited marketing. So that shows an interest and a need for these types of courses, which is why we're going to keep developing into this industry from an educational perspective.
Could I also just make a point too? The class is incredibly diverse. We have people driving from 2 hours out, 2 hours in, 2 hours back. We have young people, older people, professionals. Our Indigenous folks are coming from all over the place wanting to get more information. So when you look at the class picture, it is incredibly diverse. And I think it speaks to what the gentleman before was speaking to about people kind of crawling out of the closet wanting to get more information, but cannabis users. 60% of my practice when I was doing family medicine, 60% used cannabis of all ages. So they're out there, guys. They are out there.
What are the potential opportunities when we're talking about business, creating jobs? What is that opportunity?
So opportunity for us is creating job growth, educating our people in the industry. Currently, Long Plains has one meta store open on our urban reserve in Portage Prairie. With the opening of that store, we've created 12 full-time jobs and I believe 6 part-time jobs to individuals that probably wouldn't have had employment prior to this, just because of the fact that there is a job shortage for First Nations in that area. We're about to open up our second store, I believe December 5th or 6th here in Winnipeg on our urban reserve. And again, that's going to be creating anywhere from 12 to 20 full-time jobs, because we see our Winnipeg store doing a lot more business than our Portage, and then also including additional part-time jobs. Long Plains is currently actively seeking a partnership with to start a production company. When we open up the production company, that's going to be creating 25 jobs again for people that normally wouldn't have jobs. At the present, Long Plains is in a trade agreement with several tribes in the Americas in growing hemp, and we're growing that for the CBD extract, the food pellets, all the other products that can be made from hemp. That has created quite a bit of job growth in our community because it creates seasonal jobs, but it also creates export jobs because now we're hiring export companies to transport our product. Along with that, I know in the United States, I don't know how the laws are changing right now, but with the First Nations we're dealing with down there, they can't deposit any of their money into their banks because it's illegal in America to have any cannabis or hemp revenues deposited in their banks. So from there, we're actually creating a partnership to deposit their revenues in our banks and creating a partnership through there. And with that being done, we're going to be creating more jobs in that industry as well. Along with the partnerships that we're doing, with the exports, it's not just going to be involving the American First Nations, but it's also going to be involving Asian countries and European countries. We're already getting into that area. So, effectively it can be hundreds of jobs created within the next 5 years.
Great.
So I think the possibilities are endless. I think what we're seeing now are the entrepreneurs are really coming to the forefront, and they're the ones who are, doing the networking, connecting the dots. And I don't think we're going to see, how this is going to play out until the next 5 to 10 years to see, what the endless opportunities are. But when you think about it, it's like we need people in HR to hire, and retail and compliance teams. We also need growers, microprocessing, like cannabis and hemp. We can think about clothing and it can grow into every industry pretty much. So I think we're just starting to see the beginning of that. And again, our role at the college is to look at this from all of the industry sectors, from business to horticulture.
What would you say are some of the hurdles that you might be seeing in the industry for entrepreneurs or First Nations?
I think the biggest thing is the stigma. We've been under prohibition for so long that nobody, there are, and I guess rightfully so, a lot of concerns about this. As a parent, I had huge concerns about this as well. But when you take the time to educate yourself, it really demystifies a lot or destigmatizes a lot of what we know. We know that a lot of the information that's been pumped out over the last number of decades has really been research against cannabis and all of the harmful effects of it. But now's the time to balance that and to look at the things that we can do to help address, some of the health issues that Dr. Shelley talks about.
What would you say are some of the next level picture things that we will see in the cannabis industry?
That's a good question. I know for First Nations aspect, the big picture for us is going to be exercising our sovereign rights, coming together as a collective group. It's no different than our gaming industry. If you look at the Saskatchewan First Nations, they created their own gaming industry, which was SIGA, Saskatchewan Indigenous Gaming Authority. Long Plains First Nations, we have our own gaming authority where we exercise our right to license and monitor our own gaming establishments. And actually I'm the former director of that. And again, when it comes down to this type of aspect, we're going to be exercising our rights again to govern our own rules and regulations. And the biggest challenge that I see is the taxation from the federal and provincial governments. Again, as I mentioned, we are a separate nation, and although a lot of people get upset, we are not obligated to pay those taxes, and we will fight that as a collective group or singly.
Thank you. What role can non-Indigenous communities play in partnering and supporting First Nation efforts?
Well, I think today's a really good start. It's bringing both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples together to talk about this cannabis industry, and the fact that you're giving us some room up here as Indigenous people representing different sectors to speak about this also shows that we are connecting those dots. So I thank you for that opportunity, and I thank you for all listening to what we have to share here.
Thank you very much. So I want to close off with a quote from Grand Chief Arlen Dumas from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. Again, what I heard at the Red River Conference was that when First Nations do well, we all do well. I thought that was really, from the heart, and I believe that as well. So in the spirit of reconciliation, miigwech, ekosani, thank you very much.